Hello and welcome to the Roundtable Member Interview Podcast Series. I am Kasheka. Joining us tonight is our good friend, valued and knowledgeable member, Drew, discussing cognitive dissonance. Before we get started, though, please make sure you join, follow, subscribe to our BitChute, YouTube, and YouTube Live channels. Also, make sure you join the Roundtable Discord server where you can check out the hashtag RT Podcast and RT Podcast Series channels, where you can find this and all of our well over 300 podcasts. With all that being said, thank you to our live audience and welcome Drew on what an interesting topic, cognitive dissonance and its effects on social and political aspects of everyday life. What is it and why is it good and why is it bad?
Yeah, I'm gonna read the paper here in a little bit. It's gonna get more into details, and I have a solution, and there's some great aspects here, and there's a lot of nuances. But cognitive dissonance is essentially the emotion of disgust when you're presented an opposing view, and there's this cutoff in the human interaction at that point. So if the other party is right in this scenario and you probably should take a lesson from it, you're not going to. And that's not good because then you're not growing. And then the other example of cognitive dissonance is holding two opposing views. Like, say, I used to be a pacifist, but I'm very passionate about defending my family and loved ones, and I'm willing to die in combat for them. So the fact that I was a pacifist at one time and believe in pacifism is cognitive dissonance, that I'm willing to defend what I love, right? So that's one side of the other coin.
I would have another example. I would define cognitive dissonance as a very religious man who doesn't believe in math. It's shown that 2 + 2 = 4 through all the examples of how truth could be, proved to him, and he still doesn't want to believe it because he has faith in something else that says math isn't true.
Right. Yep. That's a good example too.
Hey, can I say something? Never mind.
Sheikha, are you with us?
Did Jewish disappear?
Hold on, we're having some technical difficulties at the moment. One moment. Kashika will be right back with us. Just so everybody knows that just joined, we are recording, so be patient with us.
Hello?
Hi there, Kashika, are you there?
I'm back, yes.
Okay, cool. I can hear you now.
Okay, perfect. Well, I was wondering, I know that you gave a brief example, right? A couple of examples we've heard. How does it affect social and political aspects of everyday life?
It gets to the point to where there's things that on a daily basis politicians are arguing about, and because they're constantly arguing, they're not finding solutions anymore. And there's this stalemate in the government over bills that probably need to get passed. For example, you could take for what's going on right now with the economy and the debt ceiling and whatnot. The other party is fighting the raising of the debt ceiling because of inflation, etc., and it's not the best solution. And there's plenty of good reasons, but the disasters that could follow if we don't do it and then find a solution, while we get to the next punchline, essentially, then people are going to suffer drastically if we don't do something in the meanwhile to find a better long-term solution, right? And so they're willing to just stand in the way of this bill, even though it's really dependent to save people, essentially. I mean, these are elder people that are going to lose their Social Security. These are veterans that are going to lose their checks, and all their care. It's really important we find a temporary solution, even if it's a bad one right now. And that's just one example of what's going on just currently.
So do you have any suggestions on how those opposing views can overcome the challenges of not hearing each other, basically, right? That's what I'm assuming that is.
Right. It comes down to understanding philosophy and psychology. Like, you need to have some understanding in the way your brain works and everyone's brain works. And with philosophy, you learn how to debate in a good style where you're respecting each other's opinions and constantly strong arming or opposing positions. And it's a different kind of format when it comes to philosophical debates. And I think that kind of charisma and respect from that atmosphere is really important to kind of get into the political atmosphere, because it's just not currently.
Would you say your own requirements for somebody to have an understanding of philosophy and psychology be part of dissonance for yourself about to the layman, for example, that's trying to understand it?
Could you elaborate a little bit more?
Well, let's say you're a college graduate, been through the gamut. You live in a different reality that a lot of people live with. You don't really connect with the wage workers and so forth, but you're just trying to describe something to them, and what they run into is this gap of being in your reality. And so you come to an impasse where you're trying to tell them the truth and they're trying to tell you the truth about what it's like to be them and understand these concepts, but you run into a wall being unable to explain that because you can't, I guess, empathize in that regard. I mean, if that makes sense.
To a certain extent, but you learn very quickly in philosophy how to have a deep sense of empathy from the opposing opposition. So even when you're talking to somebody that's like lay people, right? You know, if
Well, but that's what I mean.
if
How you're trying to empathize with the lay person that doesn't have the same understanding of empathy that you do. They're just lay. You know, they went to high school and you know, they don't really sit around and think these deep thoughts that you've done. Don't you think there's a type of dissonance that approaches with that interaction?
Yeah, there is definitely. I'm not saying there isn't, but it's about how the individual approaches that person. You know, I'm very confident that it, like, if I was in a situation with somebody that has to struggle with empathy, that I could give an analogy or two that could get that across to them, you know,
Well,
in simple terms.
I found that typically if a person, if their beliefs are questioned, like fundamental beliefs that they may have, if they're questioned, people tend to close off or dig their heels into, like as they say, right? The saying goes that they'll dig their heels in and they basically will stop listening because of their offense of the change in reality for them, right? Do you know of any kind of techniques that a person can use in order to uh, make it so that that person whose beliefs are now shattered can actually begin to hear what's being said?
Thought reformation is really good technique. Just from a personal example of like when you're trying to change a habit in yourself, when you have a negative thought, you would put a positive spin on it, and you would do this to the opposing view as well. In another sense, you would try to find why they have a positive angle, and you would just deeply consider their side of the argument, right?
That's where you were saying to have empathy for the person, right? To
Exactly.
see what their viewpoint is on it and why it is that they're closing off, right?
Right.
So when it comes to actually bringing the information out to a person who may have cognitive dissonance about any topic, is there a good way to approach that, to begin that kind of a conversation?
It depends on if they're already on the attack or not. If the doors aren't closed fully, you have a good chance of being able to have a stable conversation with someone you disagree with. Um, and it's about, you know, one, understanding from your side as you're trying to approach this person with empathy. You have to be that change, right? So you can't look at it like you're trying to win an argument, that you're only trying to express your views and that you're not trying to change the other person's views. And if you carry that kind of mentality, there's this equivalent exchange of energy that kind of happens in this moment, psychically speaking. The person can sense that you're not being forceful with your views. They can tell by the tone of voice you have, by the way you're carrying yourself, your body language, your facial expressions, etc. They can see if you're being genuine or if you're trying to force them to think the way you do. And as long as you have, a very peaceful way about you, and, you use simple analogies and be blunt in a respectful manner, and don't come off like a dickhead, essentially, then you can have a fruitful conversation with somebody you disagree with. But as soon as those doors closed, it's a problem. This is where there is no solution. It's kind of too far gone. You have to walk away from the situation because it's just going to turn toxic. The thing about it is, it's equivalent exchange. Like, both parties have to be open with one another, and all you can do is try from your side of the podium, so to speak.
If I may,
So,
can I chime in for a second? Or
what do you think, Drew?
Sure, go ahead, bud.
yeah, I'd like to add that I believe especially now, like, social media has made it so that, and also like Facebook, YouTube, not even social media, but YouTube itself, by only recommending to people stuff they agree with already, I think we are exacerbating this problem of like cognitive, maybe not cognitive dissonance, but of people not being able to hear someone else's point, because right away they're like, oh, you're part of the others, you're not in my group, so I'm just gonna not, the moment I know you're not in my group and you're not like listening to what I always listen all the time, well, I'm just gonna cut you off right away.
Right. Yeah, social media plays a huge role in how we become polarized. There's only one good way to solve that problem, and that's to find something you are very sturdy in your beliefs about and see how often they are portraying that to you, and start looking at the other side of the argument, because there's going to be pieces of their argument you're not getting, and it's deliberately so from the algorithm's part. Well, it's not so deliberately. Honestly, like, the problem with the social media algorithms is that it's as biased as you are. It is purely dependent on you and everything you feed it. So it's going to feed that back to you. So that's kind of the problem with this machine, especially when it comes to politics, is that it's not giving people the opportunity to see both sides of the argument. Like, this is the whole problem with polarized news channels like CNN versus Fox News. It shouldn't be like that. They should not be polarized as much as they are. Of course, they can represent whoever they want. That's purely fine. The problem is that they're constantly attacking each other, and that's all the media shows you, really, when you think about it, is the attacks they make on one another, not the healthy conversations they have. Those are the most viral videos, is when two news anchor men or women are just yelling at each other. Why is that the most prevalent thing in the algorithm? Well, it's because we're vicarious. We can't help it. We enjoy a good fight, and it's kind of gross when you think about it. Why do we do that? Because we're so biased and we're so confident in our beliefs that we like to see someone representing our beliefs and strong-arming them, so much so that it displays the passion you feel about it. But we don't realize is that this is toxic and that this is feeding the endless loop. There's a solution. Stay off of Facebook and research your own time. Like, look up what's going on your own.
Do you mean not to interact with others based on beliefs? Or to
No.
to others about beliefs?
Avoid your news feed. Like, when it comes to Facebook and stuff right now, because they have not perfected it. It's not good. I would say that, like Lex brought it up, it's a pretty big problem for what's going on in politics. But I would purely use Facebook for friends and families in memes. Like, I would try to stay away from the heavily polarized things, and it'll be obvious when you see them, because if you go into those comments, just think for a second how many of these are going to be hateful and just screaming through text essentially at one another. I mean, these are human beings. They're not politics. They're not politicians. They're not, government officials of any sort. These are just day-to-day people screaming at each other over the internet. And that comes down to not seeing who's across the table from you in a real interaction. Have you shook in their hand and looked them in the eye? Because that's important that you understand you're talking to a human being, and this is where it plays back in empathy. So that's where social media is a problem, is that its goal is to connect people, but it's done the exact opposite. So meanwhile, yeah, you're supposed to use it to have social interactions, but are we really doing it with good intent? So I'd say less social media, but when you do use it, try to be, the change you wish to see in the world.
So when it comes to cognitive dissonance, I'm really trying to understand what it actually means. I understand that there's opposing viewpoints where a person may believe one thing, someone comes along and tells them something completely different, and it shakes their foundation, so they close off, or they just don't want to hear it, or it causes division, and now there's a problem potentially. Is there any other type of cognitive dissonance?
Like an analogy, or like just in general?
Both.
Okay, so I think a good example of cognitive dissonance is the relationship we have with our ego. We tend to be selfish deep inside. Think about the relationship we have with ourselves and how on a day-to-day basis we constantly have conflicting views with ourselves. Like for example, you look in the mirror, you may say, I'm ugly, but you want to be beautiful. And you could be beautiful, but you feel ugly. And this is a really simple example of cognitive dissonance, is because in reality, you are a beautiful person, just inherently beautiful. Aesthetics are subjective and so on. So right then and there, you're caught in this loophole within your own self. And that's the ego playing games with you. So we constantly have cognitive dissonance with our own ego. It's like the meme we posted for the announcement with the dude smoking a cigarette. And he's like, oh, smoking's bad for him, but oh god, dopamine, yes.
Bro, this is too deep. This is too deep, bro. Oh, just keep going, man.
But that's the thing about it, is that our ego, I would say, is like our very own cognitive dissonance trying to incarnate through us. And again, cognitive dissonance isn't necessarily a bad thing, because like I said earlier, like I still hold some reverence for pacifism to an extent, and I use violence as a last resort. So that's kind of counterintuitive. If I'm a pacifist and I love with my whole heart, and I'm willing to mend wounds of my enemies, then how do I balance this out? How do I accept these two drastically opposing views I have? Well, I just do it, and I don't think about it too much, and I don't let my ego get in the way. I let my intuition say, I should probably defend this, and I should probably step back here. A good example of why we're talking about trying to avoid violence, right? Like in a heated moment when someone's screaming at you, I don't know who said it, but I'm gonna use it for today. Is that when somebody is screaming at you, whatever they're saying is an illusion. What they're truly saying to you is, I'm in pain, I need help.
Well, that's a good way of looking at it, but I think you misconstrue pacifism. I think pacifism is more of a only in self-defense, not as last resort. Like last resort is all kinds of things. You can get beaten up and beaten the shit out of and bloodied and bruised, go to the hospital, and then your last resort is to then sue them. I think pacifism is about self-defense more so than just last resort.
Right. I don't disagree with you here. And that's what we're talking about here is that there are so many nuances here. It's a complex thing. It's just about understanding how to develop awareness around these patterns we see in our interactions with one another and ourselves. That's what's really important here, not whether cognitive dissonance is bad. And I may have misrepresented pacifism to a certain extent, but what I'm trying to get across with that point is the mentality of turn the cheek. And it just doesn't always work, unfortunately. It's a beautiful ideology and philosophy, and I would say we should probably do that as much as we can. But we all have our limits. So I
Well,
100%
but
agree.
that was a Christ thing, was turn the other cheek. You know, that was like the Roman soldiers who turned the other cheek, and that's fine. But so like, I view cognitive dissonance as a innate requirement within humanity itself, because of, as you define the ego, but the ego wasn't defined until very recently. I think that there's a certain thing that's happening within the human condition that requires a defense mechanism, and that defense mechanism um, lashes out in what is now defined by the college graduates as cognitive dissonance. Now, when truth is shown to you and you don't want to show, like, you know, like I was saying, the 2 + 2 + 4, you're shown the math and you still disagree because of your belief. So there's a lot of that goes on because of their belief. Like, for example, as I always bring up, you know, like, and will be called conspiracy, certain aspects of life itself. Like, are we alone and all this stuff? And so a good example of cognitive dissonance for me would be when you tell a religious person who believes in God, is an evangelist, believes the book is the word of God, that there is another form of life out there. Their system, their entire belief structure is challenged, and they choose cognitive dissonance to say, well, no, it's, you know, like it fractures out into all these stories just to defend them being told that they're not alone. And I think that is one of the biggest questions of dissonance within mankind right now. Obviously, it breaks down into many other aspects, you know, from the micro to the macro. But I think what I was trying to say earlier is that I think it's part of the human condition itself.
It is. I don't disagree with you at all. That's it. That's not the problem of it. Like trying to get rid of cognitive dissonance. It's about having an awareness of it. Once you're aware of it, you know, you can use it to your advantage.
Well, but so what do you define it as? Do you define it as like agent awareness, for example? Agent awareness is 10,000 years ago. A man is in the forest and he hears a tree snap, and he doesn't know what animal did it, and he doesn't know how it did it. So he decides, because of his unintelligent dissonance that's going on with his head, to define it as a god or as a spirit or something. Like, you know what I'm saying?
I guess that could be an example of having cognitive dissonance, right?
Well, but I mean, more so than that, though. Like, more so, like, the root of the condition that created us to have that defense mechanism that then became part of our evolutionary requirement, that every human being has something they're suffering some form of cognitive dissonance from. Because I mean, and whether that's right or wrong, because I mean, if you suffer cognitive dissonance from something that's true, obviously you're living wrong, as we would define logic.
Like, hey,
And
can you explain cognitive dissonance one more time? Like, in the definition you used, like, I'm trying, like,
Drew, would
please.
you be able to explain cognitive dissonance once again, please?
Yeah, no problem. Cognitive dissonance. There's two definitions for cognitive dissonance. The first is when you're presented an opposing view, your natural reaction is disgust because it's different than you and you don't agree with it. And there's this door that closes in your head and communication's cut off. That's when cognitive dissonance kind of happens in a social interaction. And then the other example and definition for cognitive dissonance is when you have two opposing views in yourself. Yeah. So you can have cognitive dissonance in a conversation or with yourself. And that's just having a contradictory belief.
What was the NSA saying? All right.
so here's one example I have a question about. So let's say a political party has their mindset, and you're a part of that political party, and you have that whole mindset. Now, we have this micro cognitive dissonance, which I think is something different than cognitive dissonance. But in the macro, you will immediately, oppose this opposing viewpoint. as just a requirement of the group of people that as humans have socially been accustomed, the tribe, if you will, like whatever you have to do to maintain your social status. So is that cognitive dissonance, or is the micro the thing of like in having a immediate conversation with somebody where you shut yourself off? Because I mean, because it's slightly different, but it's not. And unfortunately, you know, the esoterics want to get into as above, so below stuff, but there's an immediate difference between man-to-man interaction about a topic and party to party, and we're a social creature that forms parties that has evolved to do this thing, but we've also evolved to have this. I don't know.
Well, I'm assuming that you mean a person, like the difference between a person who is intentionally lying to themselves just because they don't want anything opposing what their belief is on something or their agenda or their plan, as opposed to what a person just not even having the awareness of there being a difference. Is that what you're saying?
Well, part of it is like, so a political party will have this ideology, and the power players within that political party, which form the social structure that humans are required to adhere to, or else they'll die alone, kind of thing. They adopt this into their psyche. But when you get down to the one-on-one communication about this, they make jokes about the party, or they think this, you know what I mean? Like, so how does cognitive dissonance take effect internally within the certain social structures that we have on Earth if it's so permeating, which I believe it, I actually believe it is.
What are your thoughts on that, Drew?
Again, cognitive dissonance is everywhere, you know, and
Mhm.
once you just know what it is, and you got to use your intuition, because you're going to find a lot of nuances, because like you mentioned before, as above, so below. I mean, it's endless. It's all around us, and it's deeply interwoven in our day to day. It's purely just about the awareness, and you sound quite aware of it, so you're fine when it comes to probably your own cognitive dissonance, I would say. But it's just important to have that awareness. That's really the only solution here.
Yeah, but I said the as above, so below because that's the moral relativist of our past, and we're sitting here as a species trying to like mold, understand, and move around it. Like we wouldn't have even had to define cognitive dissonance without what was going on within the concept of as above, so below. So like while I might understand the old world, the new world isn't going to understand that. They can't. They won't, and it won't make sense because it doesn't make sense in our reality anymore.
Interesting.
Well, cognitive dissonance is also the mother who doesn't want to believe that her son or daughter is an alcoholic. Even though they see the evidence on a regular basis, they're choosing to not see it. Right?
Good
That's
example.
yeah.
Yep, exactly.
What's an example of a one that is beneficial?
Like, you know you're smart, but you don't want to go to study because you call yourself an idiot all the time, but you're actually smart, and you're just underestimating yourself, maybe.
I wouldn't see that as beneficial. Drew, what would you see as a good example of cognitive dissonance? Or
Right.
it working in a positive way in a person's life or society's life?
I don't have one off the top of my head right now, honestly.
Dang it, man! Like there's so many pieces that's missing. And I'm getting.
Well, I could give. So
Okay,
in Vietnam, when they came home, many war heroes given medals took their medals and threw it over the White House wall. So they were given something that they were supposed to believe in, and they defied that. And as a result of their perceived dissonance, they revolted. And that's, I mean, technically dissonance, because if the army and the government at the time understood that its soldiers would throw away the most highest honors that they gave them, Maybe the government was suffering dissonance with the people and how to connect to the people at that time. Because obviously a soldier wouldn't throw their medals over if they thought they were heroes and the government said you're a hero. I mean, that's not the way the social structure works, right? But that happened.
I would say at the once these people, like these heroes, throw the medal, it's like because I believe at this point they did not believe anymore and like the greatness of the army or whatever. Like when they went into the army first, they had these high ideas, or like it was high in their esteem, that it was a glorious thing. But after seeing what happened for real in Vietnam, there was nothing glorious there. So I don't know if it's cognitive dissonance, really.
Well,
Well,
Drew, you
but the-
mentioned before there was thought reformation. How can someone do this thought reformation that you were talking about?
On a personal level, you just like I was talking about earlier about negative thoughts, right? We constantly have negative thoughts, and what Lex brought up earlier was an example of it in itself. About if you feel stupid but you're actually smart, it affects your confidence on a certain level, and so what you would do is that you would just cave in and like fake it till you make it, so to speak. But you put your whole heart into it. You don't want to necessarily fake it entirely. You got to put some effort in, of course, emotionally, and you would change a thought. If a customer comes to me, I work at a gas station, and they have a bad attitude with me, and I want to smart off to them, or they're smarting off to me, and I have to stop myself, and I have to go, well, there's two ways this interaction can go. It can get worse or it can get better from this point forward. And so I have to reform my thoughts about how I'm feeling about this person right now, even though they're disrespecting me. I have to say, well, whether that, not that he hates me or that I'm giving bad service, but that maybe he's having a horrible day. Maybe something happened. Maybe he got fired. Maybe he got in a fight with his wife or something like that. So that's the general idea. You would constantly try to find a negative feeling you have about anything and try as hard as you can to reflect it and change it to a positive spin. And you got to be realistic with it, though. You don't want to be delusional about it.
So self-awareness, basically being aware of your own reactions, your own thoughts, obviously awareness of the situation, empathy for the other person. What other steps can a person take to be able to do that?
I think a lot of people underestimate psychology. I think that if we all kind of went in and learned some basics of psychology, that we would naturally be able to dissect each other's brains in a healthy manner. And when you have a fundamental understanding in psychology, it changes the way you look at people, and not in a bad way necessarily.
But can I say something real quick? Because like about the psychology thing, like
We're going to open it up at the end for questions from the audience.
For sure. I'm sorry.
Sorry about that, Drew. What were you saying? Psychology.
Oh, yeah. When you start to understand the way the brain works, it really just helps you know yourself a little bit more. And the better relationship you build with your brain and your psyche, the better you are going to be off in your day-to-day interactions. And psychology is one of the forefronts in fighting bad situations with cognitive dissonance. And not just psychology, but philosophy. Philosophy is really important too. Like just having a fundamental understanding in these two areas of academics or schools of thought is really important. I think it's going to change a lot of people. The more you read, the better you can handle situations in your day-to-day life.
So do you think cognitive dissonance, the whole topic itself, and how to overcome issues that are brought up because of it, is that being taught in our educational systems or outside of it? Or
it used to not be as much as it is today. When I started writing the paper I wrote, I really did not see it in my schools that I went to, and it also depends on the state that you're in. So again, this is one of those things where there is again a lot of nuances, but there are school systems out there that are slowly implementing things like philosophy more than it just being in literature. You know, they open up debate clubs and whatnot, and all they need to do is, you know, make sure that, you know, kids are getting good credit for it, and, you know, promoting it in schools, promoting why it's good to be able to hold a good debate. I think debate club, philosophy classes, and psychology classes, and just basics, nothing extreme, you know, just basics. I think if they implemented that, it would change a lot. But I think they are. I think they're slowly trying to get this in, is because the unfortunate thing is that I think it's somewhere around like the age of 30. You get all your beliefs and your biases, and you kind of sit on them, and it's not impossible, but from that point on, it's very, very, very hard to get a person to change their mind about something, even just small things, whether it be a herbal remedy that they grew up taking, and they find out, like with science, that it causes ulcers in your stomach and is doing no good for you, but you keep taking it and your stomach keeps hurting, you know, and it's like they've just been doing it their whole life that they can't set it aside. Which, you know, that's not always the case. It's probably not the best example, but I think it gets the idea across.
Yeah. Well, can you actually read that section that you were talking about before, the one that you've written? The one that you were mentioning you were open to opinions for, so that we can open it up to the audience afterwards with?
Sure. So I'll just read the first few paragraphs if that's okay. And if people want me to keep going, I'll keep going. But it's like a jigsaw puzzle. Pieces don't make sense unless you have the first couple paragraphs. So I kind of have to start from the top if that's okay.
Go for it.
Okay. Albert Einstein once said, "The measure of intelligence is the ability to change. The way we handle our social interactions is creating a lapse in humanity's collective consciousness. Consequently, it is now an oxymoronic and toxic relationship with itself. We have stunted our ability to grow. If linear thinking is parallel with lateral thinking, and they both yield results, then they are both right. Our collective unconscious is developing its very own persona, that it is largely contrived of theology. So as collective and divide of one another's foundations, this trickles down to each individual, causing self-deceit, and it can morally corrupt us without our knowledge, simply because of interpretations of one another's subjective realities. And this makes you think that you and others are outside of yourself. What Einstein said means that true intelligence is fought for by facing the self and being prudent, taking responsibility for where you or I are wrong on anything. It's not how much you know, but that if you are wrong, being able to accept that and to keep learning and growing." I think that's a good stopping point. It does build up a lot.
And
Yeah.
so what I was actually thinking just before you were saying that is that that kind of way of thinking is not acceptable in a communist ideology. And for some reason, everybody doesn't want to fight communists anymore because they don't think that it's going to affect their minds in a few generations, but they don't really understand how defiling it is to the human spirit.
But dude, China and Russia think they're doing good for the world too. Like, it's just
China shit aside, all the other capitalist things that leached off of China aside, the ideologies of communism will destroy humanity. It always will. There's no room for anybody that has any free thought or anything. There's no room for that kind of stuff. So this conversation we're having tonight wouldn't have room in the communist world. At least tonight we can be accepted that we are living in a capitalist environment that is accepting of free thought, kind of, even though it's being monitored and whatever else is going on. At least we can be free and not have, you know, the secret police come to. Yeah, I don't know if you guys have done any research on it, but
yeah. But like
dissonance comes out in the ideologies a lot in communism, if you will. If you read the Alexander Slutsky the Gulag Archipelago and what happened within Mao's China, and like they bring it up all the time, and it's like almost cliche to talk about it, but it's like a really serious event in human history that we just push over because as capitalists and people in our world, we were told to ignore it and not research it, not look about it, and not do anything about it because we didn't think anything would happen. But they, you know, they say the godless, like I'm an atheist, right? But the concept is the godless commies. And that's another form of dissonance, right? if you're shown God and you still don't believe in God, that's dissonance, right? So
Okay.
this system of governance has come up that has shown that there's something going on, and they still believe that they can conquer God. You know, man wants to conquer God, and this is where I was getting into earlier about, I think the system of government in the United States is suffering a severe dissonance in Vietnam, understanding their warriors, because they didn't understand that their warriors didn't want the medals for killing poor people. And so,
Drew,
like,
how do you see?
all right, I'll stop. I'm sorry.
Yeah. How do you
I had a question.
what can you suggest, Drew, for just give me a second after this, for the political structures that have forced cognitive dissonance? Drew, how would you suggest that change, or is it possible to change that?
Yeah, I do think it is possible to change, but it'll take like 10, 15 years, and it would be a gradual thing. Because it's sad to say, but the damage is kind of done, so to speak. But I would say that just as much, it's healing right now in its own ways. But we're gonna have to see how these next 10 years play out, and hopefully that they do get psychology and philosophy in high school and middle school, and they start giving kids before they get into the real world the tools to think for themselves and to be able to be rational and you know respectful in a day-to-day interaction, and not feel so shut off. And I think that the psychology and philosophy is going to be what is the drastic shift here for our future. The sooner it gets into our schools, the better off we're all going to be. And
Right.
I think a lot of people underestimate the impact it would have, because just to give a short example about the way psychology can drastically change somebody's life, and it's really comes down to understanding the relationships between your siblings, your parents, and your family. As you grow up, this is your environment. Your environment is so deeply ingrained in you that when you get to a certain age, you start to rebel. And this is natural. You start to challenge the status quo. You start to challenge the foundation of what your parents believe. And that's what growing is. It's challenging what is normal. And if we
That's what I wanted to talk to you about. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
it's okay, man.
I wanted to talk to you about the psychology thing, like, cause like, all right, like, I went to school and all that, but like, I dropped out, and like, I rebelled against my parents, and like, and everything, and I did the opposite of college, I learned to trade, like, just, that was just like, I wouldn't ever be able to explain that to them the whole time I was on school, like, drugged out on Adderall, getting straight A's for like no reason of myself, literally from just like my parents. But like the psychology part, like psychology is such a primitive like a criterion, like to fully describe like how human behavior, like how humans act, because humans are like really, really like beyond anything on this earth, dude. Like just the human body. So like the psychology thing, like it'll put like it'll make you put like it puts like, I don't want to say judgment on others, like, but like categories that don't really explain it all. Because like, I mean, I've met like a bunch of schizophrenics, but they are so totally different from one another that like they don't like they're not schizophrenics. Like then there's something like this, or autistic kids, like, they're so they are all like on, like, you know what I'm saying, like
So are you
I can't.
saying that the cognitive dissonance was from your parents? An example, they didn't accept you, or they didn't want to accept what reality was, or on your end?
It's just like it's just uh like just the ages that we grew up in, like we just like, if our parents told us anything untrue, like you just look it up on Google, and like I mean, I don't think that was available to any generation before us. Like I mean, we can like where we can like
You can fact check very easily, basically.
yeah, you know, so like even like, you know, the religion and the God that they taught me, like, you know, like I had to forget all that. Like I challenged all that, rebelled against all that, and then until I found my own way, then was I able to like see things that like, okay, all right, and then like
Thank
I
you for your view on that. Drew, how do you think cognitive dissonance has affected different age groups or different generations? I think you brought up a really good, a valid point, right?
Yeah, I was kind of building up to it. So, I just have to backtrack a little bit. Like the environment we grow up in is what kind of ingrains us, and through like the ages of like um probably 13 to 18 are probably our most rebellious years, you could say. That's where you start to etch in yourself. You know what I'm talking about? Like, you're no longer being necessarily affected just by your environment. You're really developing a profound sense of awareness and your own free will and where you want to stand in life. And so now you have to start carving out who you really are in these years of development. And it's all about exposure at this point as well too, because the environment is going to be constantly playing a role in this. But there is this ebb and flow of the free will and determinism from the environment, right? As you're developing this sense of awareness in yourself, it's very easy to build up an ego around it and to constantly defend it. And that's where you can struggle with cognitive dissonance in your early years. Like I was saying, like that's why you become rebellious, is because these are the years where you're trying to stand your ground and be yourself. You want to be sovereign and you want to represent who you are, not necessarily just your parents. But you're literally having to carve out a new person. You're having to reform who you really are, but you're doing it out of the same marble stone. I do like the marble statue example of this. So your parents carve you out, and your siblings carve you out, and teachers, or in general, guardians. They carve out who you are between the ages of 1 to 12, and you're built up around that environment that you grew up in. From that point forward, you pick up the chisel and start to chisel out who you are. And when that happens, you're going to be building up and standing your ground for everything. And the more you had to rebel in this phase of life with your parents or whatever, the more sturdy and hard-headed you're going to be later in life. The more you had to fight to survive and to declare your sovereignty as a child, the more you're going to do it later in life, and it becomes this pattern, and it becomes just who you are. This is just how it goes. You grow up in an environment where you're constantly defending yourself, and you're going to defend yourself even when you don't have to. And it plays out in a victim mentality, and that's deadly in itself.
So can that cause any kind of like a psychotic break if a person were to have to deal with something that's really extremely against their beliefs?
Yeah, I'd say that's what a midlife crisis is.
Yeah, because a person's typically getting older and they don't want to accept it, so they try the last hurrah type of situation.
Yeah, I got to rebel one more good time. Last effort.
So I think this is a really good point and to open it up for the audience. Any other questions or comments?
I just wanted to make a point, Drew. I like your mind. I think you got a good mind on you, and I don't mean to be an asshole, but it's what I do.
You're fine, NSA. I love you, dude. I keep coming back here because of you, honestly. I think you're the person that got me really attracted to Roundtable as well for Shogun and Kisheka. But yeah, I love hearing you talk all the time, man. I've never taken offense to anything you've ever said to me. You're a good dude yourself.
Right. Well, I have a lot to say.
don't we all? Like, but like just like my like the what you're saying was correct, but like how I approached it, like I like serious forgiveness for my parents for like all the trauma and like all the stuff and like that they put me through, and like I'm like all my siblings, but like all my other siblings that obeyed them, like that were very obedient throughout their like growing up, went to college, did everything my parents said. They don't communicate with my parents anymore. Like, but I still have, I still have like, I'm still taking care of my parents. Like when they're in their old age. Like I'm the one that's gonna be there for them. Like, even though
Well, kudos to you. That's really commendable.
Well, bro, if it makes any consolence, I spent 4 hours making a cake that I knew my mom would love, and she's been eating it once a night for the last 5 days.
God
And
bless.
yeah,
Nice.
it's
Lucky
it's been pretty fun. But
So,
so
Drew,
yeah, I mean, family's really important, man. Like really, 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 really important.
It was
And there's a problem that we have going on in this world as part of I would say part of dissonance. Like, all right, I'm gonna bring up Hillary Clinton. Like, so Hillary Clinton said she moved the State Department closer to the CFR so they could tell her what to do. And then there's a quote from her saying that we think the government should raise our children. And so like it's going so far left. And I would have voted for Hillary if I really understood what she was about at that age, but I was too young. And so once I really figured out how the world worked and how the galaxy worked, I was concerned because I was like, who would want this kind of person to make decisions because the system behind them is suffering so much dissonance within the party. And that's why I brought up the parties earlier, because I think cognitive dissonance is a real thing going on within both parties that's actually having effect on our reality. Like the
yeah, it
dissonance
seems to be
within.
affecting everything in life, every aspect of the group, right?
Oh, it's
Well,
everywhere.
but I just think the dissonance within both of our parties within the world's largest economy is really making a lot of people suffer while raising some people out of poverty. Like there's this whole thing that's going on within the system. But
Yeah, and it sounds like it's not at just the top level governing layer. Cognitive dissonance is not just happening there; it's also happening in the family structure that was already pointed out, right? So, Drew, do you have any final messages or any thoughts that you would like to leave us with?
Sure. I think just paying attention to both sides of the playing field is what's going to be important here. To kind of tie it to what NSA is talking about is like, as you consume any kind of information, always be skeptical, constantly question your own beliefs. Keep finding answers, Don't stop changing, don't stop growing. That's the whole problem here is that cognitive dissonance is what creates stagnation. We are a species, we are an organism, we have to grow. If we stagnate, we die. It's just how it is. And if we don't suck it up and start to change our ways, we're in some trouble. And that's exactly what NSA is pointing out here for the sake of the discussion. And it's the major effector. This trickles down to everybody. These people represent us, and they have cognitive dissonance on overload. And they're all like over the age of 40, which is like we talked about earlier, that, once you get to that point, it's very hard to change your mind on things. They got too far in life and didn't get the tools to have an open mind soon enough, essentially. And it's so important that the new generation coming up have that toolkit and just to prepare yourself to be offended by yourself. Because once you do become aware of cognitive dissonance inside yourself, you're going to constantly offend yourself. And I recommend looking into stoicism at that point, because that's going to be the saving grace of that point.
That's also what because I realized something like, and it's what made me had just the forgiveness that I had on my parents is that they had it even worse, just within the age that their parents grew up, and that's why I'm that's just why I'm so kind to my parents, that's why I'm like.
Well, good for you. So how does stoicism help, Drew?
Stoicism helps because it takes away the victim mentality we kind of carry about ourselves. When someone engages with us in a discussion, if they offend us, like NSA was worried earlier that he might have offended me, and that kind of gets in the way of the social interaction because I'm offended and this is over. Like we can't
Right,
talk
but you
anymore.
brought up that example, dude. Well, I gotta say one thing about Stoicism real quick. Stoicism was created by a man named Diogenes the Cynic, which led to the birth of Stoicism, and let's just say it's an interesting way to control one's emotions.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the important principle from it. I don't live up to it 100%, but it's definitely a philosophy that you should kind of look into and kind of see where it becomes practical in a day-to-day basis. But it's especially important to like become aware of when you're offended. If something offends you, you need to stop and meditate. You need to think very deeply about why you're offended. See if there's another reason why you're offended by this. It could be something else entirely. It could have nothing to do with what they said to you. And you don't
But
want
yeah,
to
like
react out of
trauma,
place.
like trauma. If you let trauma blunt you, like you're like, all right, I was ready to deal with that because I shut off this part of what I feel about this, and it doesn't make you crazy. It doesn't make you sociopathic. It might make you a stoic, which is how it's a defense mechanism of a type of religion in the past. Like
Mhm.
stoicism is a real thing that led to a lot of things that are going on right now, and
Right.
it's intense. Like it's so intense you got to stoic it out right now.
What is Stoicism? Like, what?
Stoicism is just not getting offended, to put as bluntly as possible. Don't get offended whatsoever. If you're offended, it's your fault. It's not the other person's fault.
Well, no, it's no. So
It's
like,
more complex, I know,
That's weird
but
'cause, like that's what I naturally am. So like but like there's there's just some people that will try to get a rise out of you and shit, and then if you don't if you don't like react in the way they expect you to react, they get offended. They're like, oh, what the fuck?
I'm going to tell you the best explanation and the best story will take like a minute. Okay, so there's a man named Diogenes the Cynic. He was the birth of cynicism, which was the birth of stoicism. So Diogenes, he was a philosopher, and in Alexander the Great's time, and Alexander the Great was the greatest conqueror. Was like waging war, greatest war leader ever. Was a finite man that only lived so long, and he heard the stories of Diogenes and what was going on with him. Diogenes was sitting around, talking philosophy, writing poetry, whatever he was doing. And so Alexander the Great, the conqueror of the current world, the most powerful man in the world, came and he finds Diogenes sitting out, just chilling out with his dogs, like just laying out in front of public in the main city in fuck, I forgot. Anyway, so Alexander the Great says to him, I'm the greatest conqueror the world has ever seen. What can I do for you? And he says to him, get out of my light. Because he was sitting there like enjoying the sunlight. And so like this guy who's the greatest guy ever, and that was the birth of cynicism, which was the birth of stoicism.
Thank you. And thank you, Drew. That was great. Thank you to everyone for attending and participating. Again, we are the Roundtable Discord server. And as a reminder, you can find this and all of our awesome Roundtable podcasts in BitChute, our 4 YouTube channels, and YouTube Live. Also, join us on the Roundtable Discord server. Just Google Roundtable Discord. You'll find us under Conspiracy Theories or Politics on Discord, where we record these podcasts daily. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to Rafi for recording and uploading. Let's all jump up to round